For the remainder of this chapter, we're going to delve into different categories of disorders, starting with this section talking about anxiety disorders. Now, anxiety is one of those things where pretty much everybody has experienced anxiety at some point. You have that feeling of tension or apprehension. Maybe before you write a test, you feel anxious. But an anxiety disorder is more extreme than that. It's not just passing anxiety when the situation warrants it. An anxiety disorder is different. It's more extreme. So our specific definition is that when the frequency and intensity of your responses, of your anxiety, are out of proportion to the situation. So maybe you're going to have to go write a test, but instead of just being like, oh yes, I have some butterflies in my stomach, I'm a little bit worried about the test, maybe you're hyperventilating, throwing up, crying, screaming. Those responses are way out of proportion to the degree of severity of the test. Maybe you have frequent breakdowns, frequent expressions of anxiety that are, again, more extreme than they need to be. That's when you're getting into the territory of an anxiety disorder. With that increased frequency and intensity, you start seeing things interfering with your daily life. So things like phobias, where you have a very intense fear of a particular thing or event or situation. You can have a generalized anxiety disorder where you have sort of over-the-top anxiety responses to lots of different things, or annoyingly, you can have them to nothing at all. They're triggered by whatever. Even obsessive compulsive disorder can fall under this category because you start feeling anxiety where if you don't follow through with your compulsions that something bad would happen. We'll talk a little bit more about these throughout this section. So when we're talking about our anxiety responses, we're talking about things that have 4 categorical components. So our anxiety responses have emotional symptoms. They're going to have cognitive symptoms. They're going to have physiological symptoms and behavioral symptoms. So if we break this down, starting with our emotional symptoms, you're going to have feelings of tension. Maybe you feel apprehensive. When we move on to cognitive symptoms, of course, when we talk cognitive, you're thinking about the brain and the mind specifically. So what's your mind doing? It's worrying. You start thinking about your inability to cope. You're worrying about not being able to handle the situation. So your cognitive symptoms. For physiological symptoms, these ones are awful. Things like increased heart rate, muscle tension, or other autonomic arousal symptoms. This is that terrible stuff like dry mouth, or diarrhea, or having to pee all the time. Those are all physiological symptoms of anxiety. That's your body entering that fight or flight stage where you start feeling that anxiety and you physiologically respond to the threat. And then for our behavioral symptoms, what are you doing? How are you acting in response to that anxiety? You might start avoiding feared situations. So if you're afraid of spiders, maybe you hightail it whenever there's a spider. If you're afraid of crowds, maybe you stop going to places that might be crowded. You might see decreased task performance, so you stop doing or reduce how much you're doing different tasks, especially if those tasks cause anxiety. And you might start seeing things like an increased startle response. So if you're highly anxious, you're going to be jumpy. You're on high alert because your body is ready for something. That's what all these physiological things are doing. So you start seeing things like being jumpy and easily agitated. So all of these components combine to give us that awful experience of anxiety. Now, as promised, we're going to break down a couple of the broad categories of these anxiety disorders. So the first up is going to be phobic disorders. So this is where you are experiencing phobias. or strong, irrational fears of different objects or situations. Now, a lot of phobias are going to develop young. So a lot of things are things that you're going to start fearing in childhood or adolescence or even young adulthood. But as you get older, you tend not to get too many new phobias. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, just that it's rarer. So the issue here is that phobias are very unlikely to go away on their own. It's not one of those things where you just ignore it and you'll grow out of it. In fact, they tend to get worse over time. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of which is that anxiety response, where your behavior is to start avoiding situations that cause you anxiety, means that you never face that situation, and then you just start feeling better avoiding it entirely. So you get to be afraid of it and you run away, and running away makes you feel better, so you're a lot faster to run away next time. So it kind of gets worse over time. And these phobias have different degrees of impairment, so if it's a really extreme phobia, you could be severely impaired. Maybe you know somebody who's so scared of spiders that they shut down whenever they see a spider. Maybe they can't play a video game because there's a spider as a bad guy in that game. Or maybe they can never watch the Harry Potter series because there's a spider in it. And again, this degree of impairment can depend on how often that condition is encountered. So how often are they running into spiders? And is that making it worse or not? So if we start looking at which kinds of phobias are most common, and of course it's a North American textbook, so we're focusing on Western society, but the most common phobias in Western society are agoraphobia, or fear of open spaces or public spaces. So these are people who are afraid to leave their houses. They would become a recluse because they don't want to leave the house, they don't want to go outside, they don't want to risk being in an open space. We'll also see a lot of social phobia, so fear of certain situations. A big one here is fear of public speaking or having to give a presentation or something like that. And then the big ones are very specific phobias, so things like fear of spiders. So fear of very specific objects like a particular animal or arachnid or very particular situations. So a lot of phobias, if you think of like agoraphobia and arachnophobia and all of those, there are some of the more broad ones. This is getting at the ones that are specific to you are very afraid of swimming in the ocean, or you're very afraid of spiders, or you're very afraid of snakes or clowns or whatever. That falls under that category. Now for our next broad type of disorder, we can talk about generalized anxiety disorders. And I've kind of given a little bit of this one away, but it's basically they describe it as a state of diffuse or free-floating anxiety. Basically, you feel anxiety for no good reason. In our phobic disorders, you have a particular phobia. You have a specific situation or object that anxiety is associated with. In generalized anxiety disorders, there isn't any particular trigger for that anxiety. There's no specific situation or state or condition that's causing this anxiety. You just have this general feeling of dread, this feeling of something that's going to happen, but you don't actually know what that something is. And generalized anxiety disorder is actually a really common one, where about 15% of the population between the ages of 15 and 45 experience this generalized anxiety disorder. It's 1 in 20 people, which is kind of huge. And as you can imagine, if you have this constant state of anxiety, of worry, of this feeling of dread, it's going to be draining your resources. You're constantly spending energy by being worried about something you don't know anything about. So you can start seeing issues with concentration. your ability to perform different tasks, your ability to make decisions, or even your memory can suffer because your mental resources are being used up elsewhere. Next, we can talk about panic disorder. Now, this one is a pretty dramatic shift from our generalized anxiety disorder. So, generalized anxiety disorder is going to have sort of chronic, long-term feelings of tension and anxiety. On the other hand, a panic disorder is something that's going to occur suddenly, unpredictably, and usually with a pretty strong intensity. So, it's going to happen suddenly, with a lot of intensity all at once. So this isn't a long-term, slow burn thing. This is a single event that happens really quickly. So under this umbrella of panic disorders, this is where you're seeing people who are experiencing panic attacks. And for anyone who's experienced a panic attack, people describe it as feeling like you're dying. It can happen completely out of the blue. There isn't always an identifiable trigger. Sometimes it comes along with agoraphobia, that fear of being outside and in the open, but it doesn't always have to. And once you've had a panic attack, once you've experienced this, a lot of people start experiencing fear of future attacks. Because this is something that's so intense and sudden, in the moment, it becomes the only thing you can think of, and it becomes really difficult to function normally if you're out and about. So fearing having a future attack can lead people to end up developing agoraphobia, where they don't want to go outside for fear of having a panic attack in a space where people will see it happening. Now, in order to actually be diagnosed with a panic disorder, it has to be something where these panic attacks are happening more than once. So a single panic attack does not a panic disorder make. So individuals who end up diagnosed with a panic disorder, it's usually because they've had multiple attacks. They start developing that fear of future attacks. Maybe they start developing agoraphobia, but it usually comes with a bunch of other behavioral issues along with it. And in Canadians, about 3.5% of the population end up diagnosed with a panic disorder at some point in their lives. What is a lot more common to see is individuals having sort of one-off panic attacks. So a panic attack in sort of one particular situation, and it doesn't become severe enough to be categorized as a panic disorder. People who experience just a single panic attack, that can be, in a survey of students, specifically university students, more than 30% of them reported having had a panic attack in the last year. So that's a really high number. But in a lot of those cases, it's usually triggered by high situations of stress. There's sort of more environmental factors involved there. And if it's just sort of a small number of panic attacks, it doesn't fall under the category of panic disorders. So panic attacks and panic disorders are related, but not mutually exclusive. Hopefully that makes sense. Our next couple of slides are going to start dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder. And this is probably a good point to note that obsessive compulsive disorder has for a long time been categorized as an anxiety disorder, which is why we're talking about it here. However, in the new version of the DSM, so the DSM-5, obsessive compulsive disorder ends up being sort of its own separate category that's related to anxiety disorders, but doesn't quite fall under the same umbrella. Just for your awareness, I'm going to talk about it here because it relates fairly closely to all the stuff we've just talked about. So just keep it in mind. So as you might imagine from the name, obsessive compulsive disorder is mostly composed of two very important sections, the obsessions and the compulsions. So an obsession is a cognitive component. This is where you're experiencing repetitive, unwelcome thoughts. So these are usually intrusive thoughts, things that you can't help but think. They're going to repeat, so they sort of cycle through your mind over and over and over again. And they're usually thoughts that you don't want to be having, but they keep happening anyways. Compulsions, on the other hand, are going to be a behavioral component. So this is this urge to behave in a certain way, so have repetitive behavioral responses. So what's usually happening for someone who has obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD, they have these obsessions, these thoughts that cycle through their head, and those thoughts are usually associated with some kind of anxiety, where you have this thought that something bad is going to happen for whatever reason. So maybe someone is OCD and it focuses on germs. So maybe they're really, really worried about germs, and all they can think about is, my hands aren't clean, I'm covered in germs. And their compulsion then might be to wash their hands. And because that compulsion is meant to deal with or handle those obsessive thoughts, it should make the anxiety go down. The problem is, because the obsessions are repetitive and intrusive and they're going to keep happening, the compulsion then tries to keep happening too. And people can resist some of those compulsions, but it takes a lot of mental energy to resist them. So this person might end up washing their hands over and over and over again in order to try and control those obsessions, those unwelcome thoughts. And so you can see this might become a vicious cycle of those intrusive thoughts and those odd behaviors to counter them, and it just sort of spirals out of control. And though germs and that feeling of uncleanness is a very common compulsion, you can also run into things like hoarding disorders. That actually falls under the category of OCD because people feel those obsessions, those thoughts of maybe I will need this in the future, followed by the compulsion of, well, I will keep these items so that if I need it in the future, I will have it. Things like trichotillomania, hair pulling disorder, which, again, obsessive thoughts, the compulsion to pull your hair, skin picking disorder, all sorts of different types with different categories of obsessive thoughts and compulsions to try and deal with those thoughts. And for how common this is, about 2.5% of the population will experience OCD at some point in their lives. Now, if we want to talk about what might be causing these cycles of obsessions and compulsions, quite a bit of research has shown that the obsessions are probably generated in an orbitofrontal cingulate pathway. So going from this orbitofrontal cortex down here into this cingulate part of the brain here, so something sort of back and forth between these two, whereas the compulsions are a prefrontal caudate thalamus circuit, so going from the prefrontal cortex to the caudate nucleus to the thalamus. So two different pathways that seem to link with the obsessions and the compulsions. And interesting, at least in my mind, is that they're two separate pathways. So the obsessive thoughts come from one pathway and the compulsions come from another. And this association, again, of performing these compulsions to try and reduce the obsessive thoughts, that ends up being reinforced. So if you do the compulsion and it makes your anxiety go away, or at least reduce, then you're going to be you're going to be negatively reinforced in order to do it again. So removing those bad feelings makes it more likely that you're going to do that odd behavior to make those bad feelings go away again in the future. So a little bit of classical conditioning for those of you who remember back to 104. I got ahead of myself again, going along with the picture of the brain on this slide here. These are just the names of the models for the pathways that I mentioned. So the executive dysfunction model is talking about this idea of the prefrontal cortex and caudate nucleus being involved in those compulsions, and the modulatory control model saying that there's something going on with our orbital frontal cortex and the associated areas. Those are just the fancy names for them. Now, for our next section here, the textbook talks about causal factors in terms of anxiety disorders and OCD, which we're grouping in with the anxiety disorders. Now, I kind of dislike that they call it causal factors because we're probably operating on some correlational data here, so causation is a little bit hard to infer. So maybe instead of saying that these are things that cause an anxiety disorder or OCD, let's just say that they have a really high concordance rate, or they occur fairly often and are associated with anxiety disorders and OCD, just for a little bit more propriety. But if we want to look at biological factors that are associated with anxiety disorders, there are lots of studies that have looked at genetic aspects. So there are genes that tend to associate with anxiety disorders. And in terms of evidence for that, when we look at twin studies, monozygotic twins or identical twins, twins that share 100% of their DNA, they are a lot more likely to both have an anxiety disorder than if you're looking at, say, dizygotic twins. And again, if you remember back, dizygotic twins are fraternal twins, twins that only share 50% of their DNA. So if you look at one twin, if the pair that you're looking at are identical twins or monozygotic twins, then if one twin has an anxiety disorder, the other twin is very likely to also have an anxiety disorder. Whereas if you're looking at a pair of dizygotic twins, if one twin has an anxiety disorder, the other twin isn't quite as likely to have an anxiety disorder. And that particular setup from these twin studies tells us that there's likely a genetic component. Now, there aren't sort of distinctive genes. There is an anxiety disorder gene. That's not what's happening. In a lot of cases, when you're looking at genetic studies, especially for behavioral stuff, especially for anything psychological, it's going to involve more than one gene. It's very unlikely to have one causal element, one gene that causes an anxiety disorder. But there's usually quite a few genes that get pointed to as being related. So again, a little bit more detail than we need, but that's the kind of stuff I like studying. So another biological factor that seems to be related is GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, basically one that reduces neural activity, especially in and around the amygdala and other brain structures that are going to stimulate physiological arousal. So things that make you afraid or worried or worked up. So low levels may cause highly reactive nervous system. So it might make your nervous system a lot more responsive. So people who have low levels of GABA might be a lot more easily set off by things in their environment. So those are some biological factors that seem to be related from a bunch of different studies. Now, when looking at anxiety disorders and OCD, we see a lot more occurrence of anxiety disorders in females than in males. And this difference starts very young. So as young as 7 years old, we start seeing more females than males being diagnosed with anxiety disorders. For some possible explanations, maybe it's something linked to their sex, some kind of biological disposition, maybe related to sex-specific hormones or something like that. Or if we go the psychological route, then maybe the fact that women feel like they have less power and personal control over their lives leads them to experience more anxiety disorders, more feelings of panic and anxiety because of that loss of control. Again, there's a lot that you could unpack here, but we have to stick very, very quickly or else we could spend forever on this chapter. So, moving on to more psychological factors. If we're going to evaluate that psychology side of things, we're going to talk about different viewpoints, different schools of thought. So we can talk about the psychodynamic perspective and psychodynamic theories to explain anxiety disorders and OCD from a psychological standpoint. And as always, when you hear psychodynamic, you should automatically assume Freud. So Freud proposed that people have neurotic anxiety, which would occur when you have unacceptable impulses that are threatening to overwhelm your ego's defenses and become visible to society. So you're no longer going to be able to withhold or hold back all of those improper urges that you shouldn't express in public. And so you start feeling anxiety because you're worried about having those urges out in society. And if we've learned anything about Freud's theories, this one doesn't have a whole lot of basis to it. So this theory taken at face value is the idea that a lot of the behaviors that you exhibit in response to that neurotic anxiety, that energy that you're trying to burn off, would be related to the thing that you're trying to suppress. So most of it would relate back to feelings of sexual desire or aggressive urges, which really doesn't have a whole lot of support in modern psychology. We're going to be a little bit more supportive of things like cognitive explanations. So on the cognitive side of things, again, when you hear cognitive, you should start thinking the brain and specifically the mind. So a cognitive explanation would focus on your maladaptive thoughts. So thought patterns that aren't helpful in avoiding these anxious or anxiety-inducing scenarios. Or beliefs. So different ways that your thoughts have shaped how you interact with your world. Again, maladaptive ways of approaching a scenario. And so this could also be your appraisal of a situation could come from your thoughts and your beliefs. And if you start appraising things negatively, you have this tendency to catastrophize this thought that everything's going to go wrong. Maybe you're going to point out all the ways that something could go wrong, all the ways that something is bad, and so on and so forth. So those are the cognitive side of things. Now, if we want to look at panic attacks and specifically how our cognitive appraisal of situations can interfere with that, we can look at this diagram here, where you can start off with an eliciting stimulus or stimuli, multiple things. And these can be internal or external. Maybe you think about something that has to happen. That could be an internal eliciting stimulus. Or it could be something external, like you see something that triggers anxiety. We can then have our immediate physiological responses. So you have a stress response where your heart rate increases, you start feeling dizzy, you're short of breath, your muscles tense up. And then that's when we get into that cognitive appraisal. And when you start catastrophizing, when you have these catastrophic appraisals, you start thinking really negative things that aren't going to help diffuse the situation. So maybe you start thinking, oh, I'm going crazy. I'm having a heart attack. I'm going insane. I'm going to die. Maybe you're interpreting all of these symptoms, which could be just normal stress responses, but your cognitive appraisal is that it's much, much worse than it really is, and that can trigger a panic attack because you're overreacting to a situation. So this is sort of one example of how this could go. We've already talked a little bit about learned explanations. So our talk of classical conditioning, where maybe you keep doing a particular type of behavior because it's reinforcing, it's making you feel better to do a particular action or react a certain way. But we can also have classical conditioning in terms of how you've acquired different disorders. So if you have a phobia of something, then maybe you got it through classical conditioning, where you start associating an object with something or a situation with something. And this can lead to you associating something that had previously not been fearful for you, and now you associate it with pain or trauma, and now it's causing problems. So there's lots and lots of ways that classical conditioning can come into play here. Another interesting one that we haven't really talked about is modeling. And this is a really cool one, which again, I have to keep brief because we don't have tons of time, but you can learn a particular response by watching others. So children tend not to be afraid of spiders until they see someone that they look up to display a fear of spiders. So if a child sees their mother react fearfully to a spider, they're a lot more likely to then themselves be afraid of spiders. But if you see your parents interact positively with a spider, maybe your parents would put the spider outside back in the garden, then you're a lot less likely to be afraid of spiders because you're modeling the behavior that you've seen. And of course, there are also going to be sociocultural factors, so factors to do with society and with culture, because our society and our culture defines what we view as important. So some disorders are very closely tied or bound to a culture. So some cultures really, really worry about offending someone. And if it's very important in that culture that you don't offend someone, then maybe you start developing a phobia of maybe accidentally offending someone. And so you start adjusting your behavior to make sure that you never do that. You can also have a overwhelming fear of being fat because society or a particular culture really doesn't want you to be fat, which kind of leads us into our next section where we can talk about eating disorders. And so we can talk about two eating disorders. We have anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa, both of which involve an intense fear of being fat. Those who have anorexia nervosa, they approach this, or they handle this anxiety of being fat by severely restricting their food intake. So they dramatically reduce the amount of food that they eat to make sure that they don't get fat. And this disorder, actually both of them, end up dramatically affecting women more than men. So 90% of people diagnosed with anorexia and with bulimia, 90% of them are female. And so where anorexia is you reduce what you eat, people who have bulimia will eat a lot of food, but then they'll throw it up. They'll binge on food and then they purge it by throwing it up so that they don't digest the food and have to deal with all those calories. And both of these are potentially life-threatening. They're really, really problematic because they're starving their bodies. And the reason why we're talking about this here is because this fear of being fat ends up being its own kind of anxiety. It's a very targeted fear of a specific thing, being fat. And if we want to look at, again, causes is not a word I love, but things that seem to be associated with developing anorexia, there are lots and lots of environmental, psychological, or physiological, no, I was right the first time, psychological, I apologize, and biological factors. So this is one of those things that is really common in cultures that have a standard of beauty, that revolves around being thin. So this is really common in North America. It's common in Europe. It's common in places where cultures have equated being beautiful to being thin. So if you have in your environment pictures of beautiful women and they're all thin, that's going to lead to people being more prone to either of those disorders. And this brings us into something a little bit more complicated, objectification theory. And again, we could really delve into this topic, but a lot of times when we start viewing beauty standards and we start seeing people who are very thin as being very attractive, that tends to go hand in hand with this objectification theory where people start viewing the body as an object. They're objectifying it. And so there's this idea of, well, if you want to look that way, you have to be this perfect object. You have to be that exact shape. And it leads people to sort of dissociate this from this is who I am, and it kind of becomes this is what I am. So being an object as opposed to a person. So lots of stuff to unpack. In terms of personality factors, there are lots of sort of personality traits or bits of who people are that predispose them to either anorexia or bulimia. So people who suffer from anorexia tend to be those who have abnormally high achievement standards. So these would be sort of type A personalities, people who have very strict control of things. So they are taking control of their diet and they have very high standards, so they are going to stick to the diet they choose. For people who go the route of bulimia, that tends to be associated with depression and anxiety, so they will eat in large amounts because it helps them feel better from being depressed, but then they start feeling anxiety about having eaten too much, and then they purge. And there, again, seems to be another genetic component here where we see a lot more concordance between identical twins than fraternal twins. So that's that idea of if you're looking at two individuals, if you're looking at twins, if you're looking at identical twins and one twin has an eating disorder, it's a lot more likely that the other twin will have an eating disorder than if you looked at the same situation but they were fraternal twins. So those kinds of co-occurrences gives us sort of some strong hints that there's a genetic component there as well.